This video will be all about throwing and trimming bowls. I'll be making a taller shape as compared to my usual forms, and I'll also be trying out something new, which is including a number of diagrams like this throughout the video to more easily describe some of the processes and the reasons why I do certain things. But first, as always, I need to prepare my clay. I'll be using reclaim for these bowls, and you can see just how many pockets of air are inside that lump of clay. Attempting to use it like this would be almost impossible, so before I can throw with it on the wheel or weigh it out into the pieces needed, I need to do some spiral wedging. This is a process of rhythmically folding the clay in such a way that all the air is pushed out. It also makes the mass entirely even in texture, so that no one part of it is softer or harder than the other. If you are throwing pots on the wheel, wedging your clay is an almost unavoidable process, as if it is in poor condition, you'll have a harder time throwing than you would otherwise. It's worth noting too that there are numerous methods of doing this. Spiral wedging is just one of the techniques. There's also ram's head wedging, cut wedging, and you can also use a pug mill, which is a machine that does the job for you. And I think it may be this year that I finally get one for myself. If you've been watching the clay's texture throughout this process, you'll notice how much more smooth and even it looks now, as compared to the air pocket full piece we started with. For those who are more interested in learning this particular method, I do have a whole video dedicated just to that, and I'll leave a link to it in the post description below. It does help having a slightly absorbent surface to wedge on, as it pulls in some of the moisture in the clay, which in turn helps you rock it back and forth more easily without it sticking. I then portioned the clay into some 1 pound lumps, which is 453 grams, which is a good amount for these medium-sized bowls. I then quickly spiral wedge each of these smaller lumps too, making sure that the bottom of these lumps has a nice rounded base, so it doesn't trap any air beneath it when slammed against the wheel head. I'll be making these bowls on some throwing bats, which are thin rounds of MDF, that are then attached to a leather-hard pad of clay. This means I can lift the bowl off once thrown without touching the clay vessel itself. Instead I can just lift it away on the wooden platform. As always, I spend the first few moments getting the clay completely centered on the wheel, pushing it up and down a bit, which helps to align the particles in the ball of clay and make it throw more evenly later on. Now before we proceed, let's take a moment to talk about the shape I'm going to throw. This is a very simple cross-section of the form I want to make, and it shows how I want to distribute the clay in the walls and in the base of the pot. You'll notice how I purposefully leave it quite thick in the base. This is so I have ample material to work with when it comes to trimming the footring. I also try to keep the upper sections of the walls quite thin too, as that isn't really an area I want to trim much when the pot is leather hard. And this is approximately what I'm aiming for once trimmed, and there's a lot more I'll say about this, but I'll do that later when I'm actually turning the pot. But at the moment, I'm simply focused on throwing a form that looks just like the cross-section shown here. I begin by opening up the ball of clay, and I leave the thickness in the base of about 1.5 centimeters. I then pinch and pull the clay upward, slowly towards my throwing gauge's pointer, which you can see jutting in from the right. With bowls, it's important to some degree to not only leave the base thicker than it needs to be, but also make it slightly wider than it needs to be too. The width acts as support clay for the overhanging walls, but perhaps for a tall shape like this, it isn't too important. But if your bowl overhangs a lot more, such as the shapes I usually make, then it really is. As I throw these, I'm much more focused on the internal shape as compared to the outside, as ultimately I'll be trimming the outside form quite a lot, whereas if I can avoid having to trim the internal shape, that's a good thing, as trimming inside bowls can be a pain, as all the turnings simply clog up and fall onto your turning tool as you're working. And at this stage, the internal shape just needs to be roughly there. I don't worry about the throwing lines or all the slip and water that can accumulate inside, as before I take the bowl off the wheel, I'll sponge out all this excess water and I'll go over the form, refining it with a sharp, curved metal kidney. I quickly mop out the water and the slip, then I take the metal kidney and I push its curved, sharp edge into the soft clay, pushing it into the base and then running it up the walls of the pot. I personally don't mind if there are a few subtle throwing rings towards the upper sections of the walls, but I like the base of the pot to be as smooth and rounded as possible, as that's where my glaze is going to accumulate most. I then remove some of the excess clay from down below, which helps to neaten up the form and removes what would otherwise be very wet clay, which can cause the base to take a lot longer to dry out. And it's for this same reason too that I went over the outside form with another metal kidney, just to remove a majority of that wet, sticky clay. I then use a soft chamois leather to soften the rim and give it a slight beveled edge towards the outside, and I scrape more of the excess slip off of the wooden bat. I'd rather get it off at this stage than scrape it all off later. I then use a twisted metal wire and pull it to be very taut before sliding it underneath the pot. It needs to stay flat the entire time as it travels underneath, as if the wire does bow up, it'll cut away clay from the bowl that I had intended to be in the foot ring. I then pry the bat away and set it aside. Once the bowls are leather hard, which is usually by the following day, I'll flip them over onto their rims. This way the thicker, often wetter clay in the bottom has time to dry out, as I want the pots to be almost completely leather hard before I trim them. That means that the base is the same consistency as the walls, both inside and outside the pot. I can then quickly scrape away the excess clay left on the bats, which I just chuck straight into my reclaim bucket. The bowls are then placed onto the wheel and are then tap centered very quickly into the middle of the wheel. And then before I attach the lugs down to hold it in place, I quickly just skim over this lower section, as once I've positioned the pieces of clay that hold the bowl down, I won't be able to trim that area so easily. I then push these lumps of clay onto the wheel head, making sure that my left hand holds the bowl firmly in place as I do so, as otherwise the pressure of the clay pushing against the bowl can knock it off centre. I then use a pair of measured calipers and a sharp potter's needle to score a line that marks the outside diameter of the foot ring. So, this is the shape I currently have. It's noticeably thicker in the base and the lower sections of the walls, and ideally, once the piece has been trimmed, I want the walls to be more or less even throughout the entire pot. The next diagram shows in red all the excess clay that I need to trim away. One thing you'll notice is that the curve of the bowl continues on the outside of the form as one uninterrupted curve from rim to the base and back up to the other side of the rim. The foot ring simply intersects that curve. That's the shape I'm ideally going for, and these kinds of images are often what I picture in my mind as I'm trimming. I sink the sharp edge of my trimming tool into the leather hard clay and I begin to remove the excess material. As I haven't made many of this particular shape recently, I trim relatively slowly and try not to remove too much material with any one movement. I don't want to get carried away, and usually that can end up happening on shapes that you're not too familiar with. Once the clay on the outside walls has been removed, I begin to define the foot ring itself, which now divides my bowl into two distinct sections. There's the foot, and then there are the walls of the bowl, and I just spend a few moments making sure that curve is exactly how I want it, before I go in and trim the finer details on the foot. This begins by turning in two facets. The lower one, where the arrow points, will act as a glaze catch later on. This groove that surrounds the piece will catch the glaze as it flows down the curved form of the bowl, whereas the lower facet, the one beneath it, won't be glazed. It'll remain bare, and it's on this facet that I'll stamp my maker's mark. So I begin by turning away the upper facet, and then I tuck the sharp corner of the trimming tool into the area beneath it to create the lower facet, and then I spend a moment smoothing off the curved wall that leads into the foot ring. And often I go back and forth a few times, just making sure that all the proportions are how I want them, and that the angles of the two facets are correct. This entire time my left hand is pushing down, applying downward pressure to help keep the pot in place. So this is the form I started off with, and here's what I'm aiming for once the piece has been trimmed. Personally, I quite like a tall, elegant foot ring, and it's for that reason that I leave about 1.5 centimeters of clay in the base of the vessel, where the arrow here indicates. If I were to throw the base to be too thin to begin with, I simply wouldn't have enough material to work with and to trim a nice tall foot. So if anything, I always prefer to leave myself a bit too much material to work with as opposed to too little. And I also need that space itself so that I can trim the curve on the inside of the foot ring in such a way that it'll match and follow the walls that lead to it on the outside. And now I can begin to remove clay from inside the foot ring, and this is when it helps to be confident in your throwing, so that you know just how much you can trim away. And again, I almost visualise that cross section in my head as I'm working, and I do have some indicator on the pot itself at this stage that shows just how far down I can trim, more or less, and that's the level of the walls of the pot on the outside of the foot ring. If my throwing was accurate, I should be able to trim this inside portion of the foot ring until it matches the level of the clay outside it. So I hold the tool firmly and I remove layers of clay bit by bit, and I try to cut with the corner of the tool through the clay rather than just push it down blindly almost into the base itself, as that's when you're likely to deform the base or gouge a hole out. And again, I want the thickness of the base to be as thick as the walls of the bowl itself. I don't want one part to be much thicker than the other, or have a pot where the base is much thicker and heavier and feels bottom heavy when you lift it up. Instead, I want the clay to be distributed evenly throughout the entire bowl, like so. There's another thing to consider too, especially if you're making bowls which are intended to serve a functional purpose, and that's the overall width of the foot ring itself. I measured mine to be about 6 centimeters across, and this works well, functionally. The form doesn't rock from side to side, as it might do if it was too narrow, like this. When a bowl's foot is this small and the form as high, the piece will just want to pivot left to right if filled up with food and used. And then there's the opposite, a foot ring that's too wide, and while this may work perfectly fine from a functional standpoint, visually it looks quite clumsy. It's too wide for the size of the bowl, and you could have trouble glazing the underside neatly, as the level of the base comes very close to the level of the foot ring itself. Of course, there are exceptions to this rule. So much can change depending on the shape, size, clay type, and even firing method, and of course the intended function of the bowl. So in a way, this is simply my approach, but it's also, I think, quite good practice and a good guide to follow in your own making if you are making footed bowls. I then just soften over those sharper edges with the pads of my fingers, and I do any last minute final adjustments if I need to, which usually means just smoothing over and correcting this curve slightly. And finally, I can stamp in my maker's mark onto that lower facet of the foot ring, which will remain as bare clay once fired. Pushing in my stamp does displace a tiny amount of clay upward, so after I've pushed it in, I just need to trim away that little bump that's created to ensure that the base is perfectly level. I can then remove the supporting bumps of clay, lift the piece off, and set it aside. The process of trimming, for myself anyway, and for bowls especially, really does follow a certain set of movements. I turn away the outside of the form, and then I create the two facets, and then I hollow out the inside of the foot ring, stamp my maker's mark, and then lastly, I just do any little final adjustments. And I think if you are making on a production level, it helps to do this, rather than going back and forth a lot, or starting one way and then finishing the other. In the same way that I throw all my pots to be more or less identical, I think trimming with these designated set steps also helps to yield more consistent trimming, and pots that look the same, if that is your goal, of course. There are a few other things I could speak about regarding trimming in general. From what I've seen over the many years teaching and making pots and watching numerous videos online, I think generally beginners tend to trim with the wheel spinning a bit too slowly. If you are aiming for round, consistent forms, having the wheel spin faster will certainly help that. But equally I understand that it's also a matter of gaining a certain level of confidence when trimming, and it's obtaining a certain level of confidence too, which leads into my second point, which is being strong in your movements and really removing a lot of clay quickly. When I place my trimming tool onto the clay, I'm dictating the shape that will come out. And what I mean by that is, I don't let any bump or undulation influence my trimming. I don't just gingerly rest my turning tool on the clay and watch it bounce around as I trim, removing small amounts of clay and potentially just exacerbating any undulation there might be in the walls. Instead, I trim in such a manner that if an undulation does come along, I trim right through it, removing it and causing the piece to run perfectly true again. And it's for this reason that sharp tools can be really helpful, as if you are using quite blunted turning tools, you end up having to apply a lot more pressure with the trimming tool in order to remove this much clay. And by using all that extra force, you can actually end up just deforming the pot, creating another undulation in the walls, or puncturing through the base or the walls of the pot, and things like that. Of course, it all just takes practice, and I hope this video, in combination with the diagrams, proves to be useful to those who watch, even if it is just one person. On that note, if you did find the diagrams useful, please do let me know in the comments below, and perhaps I'll start including them a bit more often. As I stamp my maker's mark, you'll see that I place one finger on the opposite side of the foot ring. This braces the foot itself and causes it not to be deformed by the pressure exerted as I press my maker's mark into the clay. Then once again, I just trim away the little bump that was created, and then I use the pads of my fingers just to soften over the two sharp edges either side of the foot. I then carefully grip the foot and lift it away, pressing in only very gently as to not distort those two facets. And if you do this and you feel your fingers sinking into the clay, then I'd say that the clay on the base is too soft to be trimming anyway. And here they are. I didn't make many of these, just 3 in fact. A test run, which I'll glaze and fire, and if I like them, I'll certainly make more, to accompany my otherwise quite shallow bowl forms. That's all for this week. Thanks for watching, and I hope you found this video useful. Let me know if you did. It's always good to hear feedback on these types of videos, and I'll see you next time.